Hey fearsome friends, and welcome to my first Christmas collaboration. Thank you to all of you who have subscribed and listened to my videos. But I can see that 38% of you haven't subbed. Next time you're here, please click that button. It would help me a lot. It's been a tough year for us all, and I'm looking forward to what 2021 will bring. Merry Christmas, fearsome friends. And even though it's a festive time, don't forget to keep being creepy.
This story is 100% true that happened to me when I was 8 years old, spending Christmas over at my grandparents' house in Wisconsin. It was just me and my mom. My dad was really never in the picture to begin with. It was just me and my mom, like I said. We lived in southern Florida, near West Palm Beach, to be exact. So it was a real awakening for us to fly over to Wisconsin, which is in the northern part of the United States, to see all that snow and the temperature difference. Oh my gosh, I remember it being so incredibly freezing out there. We were out there for a total of 1 week. The first few days were absolutely amazing. I had breakfast every single morning. I was awoken to the smell of bacon and eggs. It was something I could definitely get used to. I hate to mention this, but I was terrified of the dark growing up. It wasn't for the fact that I was in some strange house that I was not familiar with, but I was scared of the dark completely growing up. It all happened on Christmas Eve. After a beautiful ham dinner that my grandparents had put together. Well, it was mostly my grandma from what I could remember. We had our hot cocoa by the fire, listened to Christmas music, and my mom just conversated with my grandparents while I just fiddle-faddled on my phone playing games. I'm going off of memory here, guys, so please bear with me. This has been at least 15 years since this had happened. I just remember waking up sometime in the middle of the night. My cell phone was turned off. I always turn off my cell phone at night when I go to sleep. That way, nothing's running, no apps or programs or anything like that. It could just fully charge and be ready for the next day. Everything was completely dark, aside from my nightlight that was inside the bedroom where I was sleeping in. When all of a sudden, I started hearing the sounds of movement somewhere off in the wooden hallway. I remember just jumping up in my bed, rubbing my eyes and staring at the bedroom door with total fright. I remember calling out to my mom. "Mom? Is that you? Mom?" Silence. I got no reply. Confused, I was just about to lay back down and just brush it off as being old piping or something, or maybe my grandparents had to go to the bathroom or something, when all of a sudden, my bedroom door slowly creaked open. I just laid there on my side staring at the now open doorway. Complete blackness surrounded the entry. My eyes were not completely focused, as I had a nightlight in the room, so it was still a little bit dim, so I wasn't used to seeing in the dark completely to see if there was anything inside that doorway or the hallway. So I just laid there, frozen stiff, staring directly into the now open door. It was just complete blackness. At first, as my eyes started to slowly adjust, that's when I saw the eyes. The red glowing eyes. They were so dark you could almost not even see the eyes, even in the darkness. They were not bright at all. I would have saw those right off the bat. These eyes were blood red, and they were staring directly at me. My heart began to pounce, like it was coming out of my chest. Soon after I noticed those eyes, I was able to make out a figurine of this thing staring at me. It was only a little bit larger than I was. Remember, I was 8 years old at the time, so this thing was at least 4 feet tall, maybe 4.5 feet, nothing more than that. I did what any kid would do. I screamed bloody hell for my mom, grabbing the covers and throwing them over my head, blocking the view of this thing staring back at me. Moments later, the lights flashed on in my bedroom and my mom and both my grandparents were rushing into my room seeing if I was all right. I was freaked out and crying at this point, trying to mumble out words of explanation to them. They all assumed I was having a bad dream and convinced me that I was. Eventually they all left and my mom kept the door open, cracked slightly, and kept the hallway light on just in case. I remember finally calming down, laying on my left side facing the opposite direction of that open doorway, when I started hearing a graspy breathing noise coming from my right ear that sounded like it was inches away.
Merry Christmas.
This happened over 20 years ago when I was really young, and I can't remember many things about it, but I've combined what my parents had told me and what I can remember. I am Romanian, and we were on a trip in northern Russia. I can't recall the exact location. I had to be around 7, maybe 8 years old at the time, and it happened at this time of year. We rented a house for a few days in a pretty isolated place to celebrate Christmas. I had a lot of fun for the first 5 days as there was so much snow, and we had a forest about 20 meters behind the house, which is where I played with my father. It was minus 20 degrees for most of the day, and minus 30 at night. This is important to note for later. So after a long day I still wasn't tired, and was jumping on my bed, which was on the first floor, whilst my parents were downstairs. In one moment I fell off the bed, then grabbed the desk under the window to hoist myself up. As I was doing this, I looked out of the window, and I could see something moving in the trees. It was a figure, I think, but I didn't think too much about it and just went to sleep. 4 days later, the house started to smell like burned flesh, and we had absolutely no idea where this odor was coming from. We called the owner of the property to come and check it out. He opened the door to the attic to see if anything was up there. It took him 2 hours to get to us, but he found nothing. He locked the attic back up and left. That night I was kept awake hearing footsteps, and I thought it might have been my dad, because he's a pretty big guy. The next day I heard the steps again, but this time they were coming from inside the house. And then suddenly I heard the attic door open, and the sound stopped. Confused all morning, we just thought the owner hadn't locked the door properly, and it had opened on its own, and the footsteps we heard were simply the pipes having an issue. This conclusion changed the next day. On Christmas night, as we were all sat at the dining table, my mum noticed movement outside. We all ran to the window, and there he was. It was a tall, naked man, and he was in the woods. My dad quickly got our gun and went outside to see what was going on, but there was nothing there. No man, no footprints, nothing. Just endless snow. The next day we thought it better to stay indoors to play, as my parents were worried. But being a child, I didn't care at all. That night I went to sleep early. Then roughly around 6 a.m. I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. I slowly opened my eyes, and there he was. The man, with his face pressed up against the first floor window. He was skinny, pale, and had some hair on his head. It's just the weirdest part is that he was naked in -30-degree temperature, just looking through the window. I screamed for my dad, and in less than 5 seconds he was in the room, with the gun in his hands, and followed by my mum. I was crying and told them what had happened. But looking again, nothing was there. No footprints in the snow, and the smooth layer of snow on the walls was untouched. My father suggested we leave, but the snow was over 2 meters by now, and the car was in a small garage that was blocked in by the snow. We spent most of the day trying to contact the owner, and the police this time, but the phone line wasn't working well, so they were unable to understand what we were saying. The whole day we didn't speak about it. Only when the sun started to set did I go to my room and play with my toys. Then late that night I heard the attic door slowly open, since it was directly outside of my room. Then I heard my room door open. I hid under the blanket and tried not to breathe, trying to stay as silent as possible. After that I didn't hear any footsteps or any other sound until the morning. Petrified, I ran out of my room when I heard my parents were up, and I told them what I'd heard. They told me that I just had a vivid imagination, but that the locked attic door was open, and when I returned to my room, I saw a rope on my bed that was in the shape of a human. I told no one about this. Once the snow had cleared, we left. The property owner arrived to clear the place up, and just as we were saying our goodbyes, I said that I'd forgotten my doll, so I ran back to the house to get it, and I swear that I saw this man again, and he was standing in the end of the dark hallway. I turned and just left. It took me years to understand what I'd seen. This weird, skinny and naked man that was well over 2 meters tall, that was just standing there, staring. The Christmas tree in the town square stood tall for all to look at in awe. The varying reds and blues and yellows and greens coiled around the towering tree like a colourful snake. Children tightly clutched the hands of their mothers and fathers and grinned with crooked teeth at the masterful display of the holidays. Its light cast onto the empty buildings and lonely streets emptied by the men and women standing around the spectacle. In the wake of the cheerful holiday smiles came another surprise. Snow began to fall from the sky, dressing the streets in a growing blanket of sparkling white. Heavier than a flurry, yet not quite a storm. Children stuck their tongues out with flushed cheeks, giggling as a myriad of snowflakes melted on them. And for that moment, in the bitter cold, it seemed as though the world revolved only around that tree that stood tall in front of them. But there was, of course, the one and only family within that small town who had decidedly rejected the invitation to be around the others. Alas, the woman was much more content sitting idly in her chair and waiting for information regarding her husband. She had told her child that he had been out working the last few days, trying her best to cover up the fact that he had, in fact, gone missing. Now, with 4 days gone by and nothing to show for it, all she could do is stare intently at the static on the television and neglect the wilting Christmas tree. The woman barely grasped the half-empty bottle of vodka in her hand, and when she heard the pitter-patter of soft feet, she instinctively placed it in the shadows beside her. Her gaze fell on the small boy that sprinted into the living room, waving a tiny turquoise blanket back and forth. "Mummy!" His shrill voice cut through the buzz she had acquired from the alcohol. She winced. "There's a man with a badge at the door. He says he wants to talk to you." Her daze was immediately broken as she sat upright in the chair, staring at him with a furious rage in her eyes. "You open the door!" she scolded. The boy stared at her for a moment before looking down, only to be met with a backhand across the face. He stepped back, grabbing his reddening face with tears brimming in his eyes. She stood up, exhaling sharply. "I told you to tell me first when someone knocks." She sighed in exasperation, stumbling out of the living room and hugging the wall for balance as she moved to the front door, opened a crack. Deep in the background she could hear Frosty the Snowman playing in the boy's room. She shooed her child away, opening the door up enough for her face to be seen. A police officer stood in the snow, fingers in the loops of his belt as he greeted her with a grin. She met his grin with a deep frown. "What are you doing here so late?" Her voice was slurred, causing the officer's expression to waver. "Your husband." His voice was deep, but as soft as his expression. "We've learned a bit more about where he might be." Her expression almost immediately changed. She stepped back, opening the door fully. The officer stepped in, raking his feet across the welcome carpet first as a blast of cold burst into the warm home. She closed the door quickly, shuddering from the bitter weather. Further down the lonely streets, there was movement in the dark shadows beside the buildings and broken lampposts. A figure walked through the darkness as if it was their home, the hood on his head further veiling the lithe person's face from view of the naked eye. The being walked slowly, as if savouring the bitter cold that surrounded them as pitch-black boots left prints in the thin blanket of snow. The figure began to speak with the voice of a delicate man. It was a whisper, with the softness of an enthralling lullaby. However, there was a clear malevolence within his undertone. The soft noise sung at a slow pace. "It's the most wonderful time of the year." Nobody was around to hear the man's enchanting voice. However, he seemed to enjoy the solitude surrounding him. Under his arm he cradled a large cardboard box wrapped haphazardly with a variety of different papers. A substance dribbled from the bottom corner of the box and onto the snow, though the hue was unseen in the darkness. "With the kids jingle belling and everyone telling you, be of good cheer." The shadowed man suddenly was subjected to the dim spectrum of a barely functioning streetlight. Pitch-black eyes sparkled against the brightness as his pale and sunken-in face was shown. However, the visual was only granted for a brief moment as he continued his troll. A droplet of crimson red sunk into the blanket of white as he passed by the streetlight. He looked forward to the police cruiser parked in front of the home that he had been traversing through the snow to find. A small grin formed on his features. His soft feet cracked against the snowy sidewalk with a purpose as he tried his best to stay within the darkness, inching closer to the home. Eventually he stood at the front of the dreary yet moderately lit up building, and at that point he walked up the 3 concrete stairs, continuously singing to himself. "It's the most wonderful time of the year." He placed the box down at the top step, adjusting the large ribbon that had been placed on it. He stood up, his grin growing from ear to ear as the light washed over his face. A large and jagged scar ran from just beside his eye all the way to his lower jawline. He lifted his clenched-up fist, rapping it on the door a few times. He waited for a moment before turning around, quickly slinking back into the shadows before the door was opened. The woman had taken her place back in the reclining chair. The officer stood awkwardly as he explained the current situation to her, purposefully ignoring the stench of alcohol in her breath and darting his gaze away from her half-closed eyes. She pushed her bottle of vodka back behind the chair as she listened as intently as she could to the man. She nodded slowly. "So you found his car?" The officer solemnly nodded, granting her another faint smile. "Yes, on the outskirts of town, hidden in the trees." He looked away from her fully now and glanced at the Christmas tree that had shed much of its pine needles due to malnourishment. We don't know why it's there or where he ran off to, but it's a start. They have the K9 unit sniffing for any abnormal scent right now. The wife took solace in that knowledge. Her husband possibly being okay was better than the uncertainty she had been facing. As if on cue, the little boy ran out into the living room once again, practically jumping from the balls of his feet. "I heard a knock, Mummy." She sat up with a sigh. "I didn't open the door this time, Mummy, I promise." She pushed past him, walking down the hallway with the police officer behind her. She opened the door only a crack at first, checking to see if anyone was actually there. She saw no person, but a large gift placed at their doorstep. With a raised eyebrow, she opened the door, glancing to the various different wrapping papers used to wrap around the outside of the box. The officer eyed the present closely before his expression changed. Great concern washed over him as he stepped in front of her with a nervous chuckle. "Let me open it first. Probably just some pranksters again." He stepped outside and took out his box cutter, getting onto his knees as he drew in a deep breath. This wasn't the fault of any teenage pranksters. He had been in the force long enough to know exactly what this was. With great caution, he took the ribbon off and tossed it aside, pressing the blade into the wrapping paper and through the top of the box. He ran the knife across until he was able to open the top with ease. As he opened it, he drew back quickly, covering his mouth as he fought the urge to vomit. The present had been even worse than he imagined it to be. Curiously, the wife took a look inside, her expression distorted into shock as she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed across the darkened sky. She hugged the wall as the little boy ran to the noise. "Mummy, what's wrong?" But she didn't respond, simply falling to her knees as she sobbed into her hands. The boy placed a small hand onto her shoulder. "Mummy?" The child moved to take a glance at the contents of the present. However, the officer stood up quickly and covered the boy's eyes, drawing him back as he stared inside of the box in terror. Inside was a severed head, submerged to the chin in its own pool of blood. The man's hair had been matted with the substance, and his eyes were wide, almost alive with terror. His mouth hung open, and his face was riddled with cuts and bruises. A scar ran from just to the right side of his eye, all the way down across his cheek to his lower jawline. Atop of his head was a Santa hat, tainted with droplets of blood. The officer pushed the child back to his mother, who held on to her with a confused expression on his face. The officer barely stood on shaky legs, holding a ripped piece of the wrapping paper and staring at it. It seemed that the legends were, in fact, true. He stared at the sticker that had been stuck to the wrapping paper, a still image of Santa waving his mitten to the person looking.
Why I Don't Believe in Santa, posted by Darkened Pages. When I was 6 years old, all I wanted for Christmas was a new red Huffy bicycle. I wrote to Santa right after Halloween, making sure to give him extra time to get it for me. I did every chore my parents asked of me, and I brushed my teeth every morning and night. I even gave the $3.52 I'd earned from clearing Mrs. Baker's driveway the last time it had snowed. We only got a light dusting, but she was a sweet old lady and let me use her broom to brush away the thin layer of flakes that hadn't already melted on their own. Needless to say, I was certain I was on the nice list, and thus had secured that magnificent bike. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, my mother made fish for her and my father, but since I didn't like fish, she let me have chicken nuggets instead. After dinner, we snuggled on the couch to watch the colorful lights twinkling in our heavily decorated Christmas tree, which had about slightly to the left side because when we put on the ornaments, I kept placing them all in the one place I could reach. My mother read me The Night Before Christmas. Then we watched some Rankin Bass specials until the lids of my eyes grew heavy and I was ready for sleep. We put out a plate of chocolate chip cookies and a glass of milk on a table near the fireplace for Santa, as well as some carrots for his reindeer. Then I headed to bed. I was fast asleep from the moment my head hit the pillow, dreaming of riding around on a new red Huffy bike that I was so sure I'd be getting the next morning. My slumber was interrupted when I was roused by a clatter, causing me to wake up fully alert. I excitedly climbed out of bed, doing my best to be silent as I quickly crept towards the living room, suspecting what I might see. When my head peered around the corner, I nearly yelped in delight. A large man in a red coat and hat was looming over the table where we'd left the snacks. I could hear him slobbering as he devoured the cookies and slurped down the milk. Tiptoeing forward, I stood at the edge of the room and said in wonderment, "Santa?" The man whirled around, knocking the table over when he did and causing the empty glass of milk to shatter when it hit the ground. Now that I could see him better, I was a bit shocked by his appearance. His coat was covered in dirt and filth, but I figured that was just due to him constantly going up and down chimneys all night. However, his long white beard was fairly unkempt, and there were flecks of grime and bits of half-chewed cookies peppered throughout. His teeth looked yellowed and rotten, several of them chipped or missing altogether. He glanced around with wild eyes until they finally found me, and he seemed to relax, the corners of his mouth turning up into a grin. It's just you," he said in a gruff voice that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Why aren't you in bed? You don't want me to take back all these presents I've brought you, do you?" "I'm sorry," I replied apologetically. "I heard a noise and just wanted to see if it was you." "I guess Santa wasn't as silent tonight as he should have been." He sat down on the edge of the fireplace and said, "Why don't you come tell Santa what you wanted for Christmas, and I'll make sure I got it right." I hesitated for some reason, as if deep down I knew something was off. But this was Santa Claus. It had to be. Who else would have come down the chimney and eaten the cookies and drank the milk and left all these presents? So I shuffled over to him, trying not to let him see me wrinkle my nose when the stink emanating from his clothes filled my nostrils. He patted his knee and said, "Come sit on Santa's lap and tell me." I climbed onto his knee and noticed it felt a bit damp. He let out a laugh, but it didn't sound like the ho-ho-ho you'd normally think Santa would do. It was more like an over-eager laugh that became a cough halfway through. And when he did this, I was hit by his reeking breath. I stammered. "I wanted the new red Huffy bike. Remember?" "Oh, of course," he replied, grinning wide enough that I could see just how many teeth he was actually missing. "Well, have you been a good boy this year?" "I think so," I answered meekly. "I did all my chores and listened to Mommy and Daddy and didn't cause any trouble." Good. Then I believe you made the not naughty list this year, my boy. Why don't you go have a peek at your presents? You might just find one that looks suspiciously bike-shaped." He grabbed me as he stood up and placed me down on the ground, then ducked into the fireplace. He turned back towards me and said, "Remember, I see you when you're sleeping, and I know when you're awake. I know when you've been bad or good, and if you've been bad like your mommy and daddy, Santa will have to give you coal in your sockets." "You mean stockings?" I asked, but he just grinned and began the climb up the chimney, moving like a spider as he disappeared. I heard him clattering on the roof, and then he was gone. I started checking all the presents that were underneath the tree, moving box after box aside as I hunted for the bike. But I didn't find one large enough that could have contained it. Disappointment set in, but I tried to fight it back. knowing I should be grateful for what Santa had given me and not be greedy. I sat down on the couch and thought hard about what I could have done to make Santa not give me the bike, and why he would have told me that there could be one there when he knew there wasn't. I fell asleep while pondering this conundrum, but I didn't dream of the red Huffy this time. When I woke up again, it was still fairly dark, but I could see the first glimmers of dawn breaching the starlit sky. I got off the couch to go use the bathroom, but something caught my eye. It was hard to see at first, but as I looked closer at where I'd been sitting, I realized there was a large, rust-colored spot staining the couch cushion. Worried I would get in trouble, I flipped the cushion over and hoped my mother wouldn't notice. On my way to the bathroom, I checked the clock and saw it was almost 6 in the morning. I figured my parents had gotten enough sleep, so after I was done emptying my bladder, I made my way to their room to let them know it was Christmas morning, and Santa had delivered a bounty of gifts to us. I decided I wouldn't mention anything about the bike because I didn't want them to think I was acting like a spoiled brat. I arrived at my parents' bedroom and was a bit puzzled as to why their door was ajar, as they'd always kept it closed at night. I pushed it the rest of the way open and rushed towards their bed. "Mommy! Daddy!" I called out excitedly. "It's Christmas!" When I got no response, I leapt onto their bed and jostled them in an attempt to wake them up. "It's Christmas!" I repeated, but I still got no answer. I pulled the covers down, hoping the blast of cold air would do the trick, but nothing happened. I pushed my mother a bit harder this time, and she rolled over onto her back. "Mommy?" I choked out, and I could already feel the tears welling up and stinging my eyes. "Mommy, wake up. Please wake up." I was only 6, but I knew almost right away that she wasn't going to wake up. Her chest was covered in blood, and there was a large hole in the middle of it. I rolled my father over to find him bearing a similar wound. The thing that horrified me the most, though, was their eyes. They were staring at me with big, shiny black eyes. They'd had coal stuffed into their eye sockets. It was just like Santa had said. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there with my parents' bodies for hours. I heard the phone ring several times, but I wasn't allowed to answer the phone, so I just let it keep ringing. When I saw a dim red light reflecting through the window and onto the ceiling, for a brief moment I panicked, thinking it was Rudolph's nose and that Santa had returned to give me coal as well. But the red was soon joined by blue, and when I looked outside, I saw an ambulance and a couple of police cars pulling up to my house. It turned out that my aunt had been calling since we were supposed to go over there after we opened presents. And when we didn't show up and nobody answered the phone, she called the police. They found me sitting amongst my parents' corpses and quickly carried me away, trying to shield me from the horror of the scene, but the damage had already been done. Everything after that was a blur of people checking to make sure I was okay and talking to me about what happened. I told them about Santa and how he lied to me about the red Huffy bike. They brought me over to the garage and showed me that the bicycle I'd been dreaming about was sitting there with a red bow wrapped around the handlebars. I had wanted that bike so bad that I knew I should have been happy, but I just felt nothing. My aunt ended up taking me in and raised me alongside my cousins. She was good to me, as close to a mother as she could be. But I still thought of my real mom every night before I fell asleep. I tried so hard to remember her laughing and smiling, hugging me and kissing my forehead before bed. But the only image of her that ever popped into my mind was of her lying there, staring at me with those big, coal eyes. They never caught the man that murdered my parents, and I wonder about his last words to me. I worry that one day I'll see Santa again, and that will be the last thing I see with my own eyes.
This happened over 20 years ago. It was Christmas Eve, and I was driving back home with my girlfriend at the time, and my mother's family used to hold a large celebration at my aunt's house in Estacada. This was my girlfriend's first time meeting with my extended family, and she got on quite well with them. We spent the majority of the afternoon and evening talking, playing poker, opening presents and drinking. My girlfriend was quite inebriated by the time we had to leave, so needless to say, I was the one driving us home. It was around 11 p.m. or so, and I was driving my girlfriend's car along Highway 211. Now this stretch of road is surrounded by farms and dense patches of forest, and parts of it are unlit, but I felt nothing to fear as I grew up in this area, so I knew this road like the back of my hand. The both of us were just driving and talking, just two young lovers making the most of our moment together. We'd come to a portion of the highway that descends down an enormous hill before crossing Deep Creek, and surrounding both sides of the road are thick forests. There are no lights. The only thing we could see was the area directly in front of our headlights. I drove down the hill, across the bridge and uphill through more forest. It's as the highway starts to flatten out that it happens. Something sprinted across the road so suddenly that I almost hit it. I slammed on the brakes and turned to my girlfriend to ask her if she'd seen it too. She confirmed that she had, but she couldn't make out what it was exactly. We thought that maybe it was a coyote, as they are a fairly common sight in this area. Something felt off about it though, and whatever it was just disappeared into the woods next to the road. Coyotes don't usually just dart out in front of cars. Not like that, anyway. So for some unknown reason, I decided to check it out. I turned the car around and switched on the high beams to better light up the forest. I stepped out of the car and tentatively walked towards the woods. I didn't see anything, but now it felt like perhaps I'd made a grave error. My heart was pounding, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing at full attention. Despite this, though, I still didn't see anything unusual in the trees. Suddenly, the car's horn blasts continuously. I quickly walked back into the car and asked my girlfriend why she'd leaned on the horn like that. She said nothing. Instead, she pointed to a spot about 50 feet away from where I was standing. I looked over. Surely this was the thing that ran in front of our car. It was a man. He was completely naked. His skin was covered in dirt and mud, and in one of his hands he was holding a hatchet. He was looking right at us when he then smiled, waved, and then turned around, making his way back into the forest. We got the hell out of there as fast as we could, and once we were safely driving again, my girlfriend explained what had just happened whilst I was out of the car. She said the man, in the area he initially vanished in, had circled back around and come out from another spot in the forest, beyond my car headlights. My girlfriend had seen something out of the corner of her eye, and that's when she saw him. Before she honked the horn, he was walking towards me, with his hatchet raised as if to strike me. We called the authorities once we'd gotten safely back home, but they never found anybody. Or they did, and they just didn't tell us. But the officer we spoke to explained his theory. The man was obviously looking to ambush unsuspecting lone travellers for Lord only knows what. We all agreed that my girlfriend's quick thinking saved my life, as it let my potential killer know that I wasn't alone out there. I moved back into the area recently, so I now drive that highway often. No naked hatchet man sightings yet, but I can tell you that I'm definitely extra vigilant now, especially near Deep Creek.